Hey everyone, it's Sarah and I'm back to fill my reading journal for the month of March. I will say this month I only read 6 books, which is less than I wanted to. My goal is always 7 for the month just to keep up with my reading, yearly goal. But this month ended up being busier than I anticipated. I had some changes, or things change around in my schedule near the end of the month. And so, yes, I could have pushed through and finished some of the books I'm currently in the middle of, but 6 books is still pretty good. My favorite book for the month was A Girl and Five Brave Horses. I read 2,081 pages, and my average rating was 4.17, which is really good. Then looking at, kind of when I started and finished things, a lot of things kind of at the end of the week was when I was doing a lot of reading. I did a lot of reading over the weekends, which makes sense since that's often where I have more free time. Then I did a good mix of Kindle, physical book, and audiobooks in terms of what type of media I was reading. And then in terms of my goals for this month, I did have the 2,000 pages, but I did not read 7 books per day. I did read every day. I did an okay job of tracking my pages read on Storygraph. I'm still not in a great habit of doing that, even though it's good for, some of the graphs and the visuals that it generates. I'm just not great at remembering to do it every day. And I have been writing even just a short 1 or 2 sentence review when I post my rating on those social media platforms or, Goodreads, Storygraph, and Fable. I pulled a quote from A Girl and Five Brave Horses. I didn't care what I maimed or broke, just so I looked as if I knew what I was doing. Then, in terms of what I started and finished, I'm in the middle of 3 books that I'm carrying over from March to April. I have Empire of Storms, which is the next Throne of Glass novel, and I just ended up having my hold or my checkout from the library lapse, and so I started it but I didn't finish it before it lapsed. And I do have the physical copy as well, so I just need to pull that down to finish that off, maybe physically instead of as a Kindle book. And then I have Game Changer in the Book of Life, which again I probably could have pushed through and tried to finish one of those by the end of March, but it ended up just being a busy end of the month, or a busier end of the month with other things. I did not read either of my March book of the months, so for April, hopefully I can at least catch up and try to read February and March book of the months, because I haven't read either of those, and I've been trying to read my book of the months in a more timely fashion. Then in terms of my bingo, I did pretty good this month, and had a couple of bingos. I try to just pull prompts from the back of the book, as well as focusing on book of the month or my 26 and 26 list as well. And then in terms of my top priority books, I finished 2 out of the 3. A Girl and Five Brave Horses, This Is Your Captain Speaking, and then the book that I'm still in the middle of is The Book of Life, which I'm over halfway through that one. It just didn't get finished in March. And then moving on to my format tracker, again, I had some physical books, Kindle books, and audiobooks, so a pretty good mix this month. In comparison to number of pages, I feel like I'm still really on par with what I normally read, but just a little less than those 7 book per month goal. Then I have my bookshelf tracker from JoJo's Pretty Paper Shop that I'm just writing in the books as I read them, and my Plan with Elise Reading 100 Books tracker. I'm at 23 so far for the year. So then moving into the individual books, the first thing I read was Shadow of Night. This is book 2 in the All Souls trilogy. I guess it says it's a trilogy, but then I just noticed that there's a book 4 and a 5, so they must have added those on after the fact. So I don't know if I'll read those or not, but I guess we'll see how book 3 goes. But I do hate that when it starts as a trilogy, or it starts as, just a small series, and then it does well, and then they add on more books. Like sometimes it works out well, like the Hunger Games, but then there's other times when it just feels a little bit unnecessary. So we'll see how I feel. But I overall enjoyed Shadow of Night. I gave it 4.25 stars. This one had a slow start. I felt like there were a ton of new characters that were introduced at the start of the book. You're in a completely different setting and location. There is time travel involved with this book, and so it kind of took me a little bit to get my bearings and to really get into the story because of some of that. And there were a lot of historical, like real historical figures that they put in this fictionalized book. And I feel like I didn't know who all of them were. And so sometimes I felt like I was maybe missing out on, I don't know, missing out on something because I didn't really know who so and so was. Like, I know who Shakespeare is, but, there were other characters that were more prominent that I don't know all of the historical basis for who they are, or what they did, or how they're important. And even though the book explained some of that, I feel like there was just more that I should know. And then as the book got going, I felt like I was more invested in the story. But again, it kind of took a little bit to get into it, which is part of the reason why I deducted some points. Then we have The Letters We Keep. This is a story about Jesse and Ravi. They're both college students. Jesse is a first-year student, and Ravi is, I can't remember if he's a junior, or I think he's like a junior. He's a couple years older than her, and he comes from a very well-to-do family, and, he's essentially expected to have a degree in computers so he can go into the family computer business and, fulfill his legacy. And they end up meeting or crossing paths because they're trying to reserve the same study room. And so then they end up, kind of like fighting over the study room, and, they keep crossing paths because of it. And the library at their university has a mystery involved with it. There's a section of the library that's closed off that is or was involved with a fire 50 years ago. And the night of the fire, 2 students disappeared. And so some people say they died in the fire. Some people say that they caused the fire as a distraction and ran away. And, there's kind of been out with this mystery, like no one's ever heard from those students again. People don't even remember who they are at this point because it's been 50 years. Don't even know the name. It's just this kind of like mystery, urban legend, kind of surrounding the university and the library specifically. And so somehow they end up in the library, and they find a hidden stash of letters from these 2 students. And so then they decide that they're gonna write this project on these 2 students and the letters, and read through them and try to figure out the mystery. I thought it was fine. The mystery itself was really predictable. It really didn't offer the twists or the surprises that I was hoping for. I also, because I was reading this as a Kindle digital version, it was hard because they introduced some of the letters at the beginning of the book before the characters actually find the letters. And so there were a couple of times when contextually I wanted to flip back to some of these, letters we had in the beginning of the story to try to place them with letters that they were reading later in the story. And I found, that it's just hard to flip back and forth in a Kindle book or a digital version, whereas, a physical book, it's easy to flip back and forth. And then also too, there's a romance, because of course there has to be a romance. They can't just be friends. And I just felt the romance was really rushed. You go from a character who's never had a boyfriend to, they have their first date and you know, she's in bed with him a week later. Like, it just feels unrealistic to me. And I don't love the insta love, you know, like it has to be done in a particular way for me to really believe it. And I just didn't really believe this, you know, insta love story. So I thought this was just okay. It's pretty forgettable. But, and then also too, they're both from like Asian families, I think both Indian, and there was a lot of, you know, kind of cultural plot points, or just different situations where they're like, oh, like, you know, we can't do this because, you know, people will tell my family, or, you know, other people in the community won't like that. And so sometimes I felt like the cultural bits were a bit repetitive, because it felt like there was always a reason why they couldn't do this or that, and it was always the same reason, that kept kept getting nailed into the story. So, you know, that I think it's fine to explore different cultures and stuff, but there were just times that I felt like it was repetitive. But, you know, like I said, it was a fine story. I just wanted more from it. Next, we have The Vanishing Half, and this is a book it's been on my TBR, but I keep putting it off. I've had the, you know, hold available from my library for a while, and I finally picked it up, and I think the reason I had been pushing it off was I just couldn't remember what the story was even about, just that, you know, people had said it was good, and I'm glad I finally did pick it up. The audiobook was really good because I had a good time with this one. I gave it 5 stars. So in the book, you have 2 twin sisters, Stella and Desiree. They live in a town called Mallard, and Mallard is kind of an anomaly of a town. Everyone in the town is African American. They live in the segregated South. The story starts in like the 1930s is when they're born, and they live in the segregated South, but this town is a community of very light-skinned African Americans. And so, you know, that they essentially formed the town years ago just because they weren't accepted by white folks. And then, you know, the African American, there's, you know, darker skinned African Americans, you know, didn't necessarily get along well with them either. Like, they just were kind of an anomaly where they didn't really fit in. So then this town was formed so that they could, you know, similarly be with other light-skinned African Americans and, you know, have this kind of community all together. And the girls tire of living in this small town. They tire of this, you know, kind of same community that they've always been around. And so they run away when they are, I believe it's like 16, and they run away to New Orleans, and no one knows what happened to them. Well, now it's 10 years later, and one of the twins, Desiree, has returned back to the town, and Stella abandoned her in New Orleans, and, you know, she doesn't know what happened to Stella, and she tries to figure out what happened to her, but she's been unsuccessful. And essentially it's, you know, continues following her life and her daughter's life. And, you know, the book explores a lot of different areas of, you know, racism and acceptance, and, you know, what people want out of life, and the choices that people make. And I thought that it was really thought-provoking. I had a lot of interesting thoughts, or just interesting conversations with the book, and I had a good time with it. And you know, it continues following these characters, you know, for another, I don't know, 40 years. So it goes from, you know, when they're born in the 30s all the way to more or less present day. Then I have The Woman in Suite 11. Ruth Ware is one of my favorite authors. I really enjoy her mystery thrillers, and this is a sequel to The Woman in Cabin 10. And it's been a while since I've read The Woman in Cabin 10. I just rewatched saw the movie that Netflix put out not too long ago. And so I did have a little bit of familiarity with it. I wasn't totally in the dark. But one thing I thought the book did well is, since it's a sequel, since it may have been a while since people have read the original book, because it's been quite a while since the original book was released, I thought that they did a good job of providing context, so someone like my husband that never read The Woman in Cabin 10 could still follow the book and you know, have context, figure out what was going on, even if he didn't read the first book. But I don't want to say too much about it, but our main character, Lo, is, or used to be, a travel writer. She, you know, kind of took a hiatus from her writing to have kids. You know, right when she was about to go back to work, COVID happened, so then she didn't go back to work. And now she just, you know, is feeling a little unfulfilled and wants to get back into writing. And she finds an opportunity to write about a luxury hotel opening, and, you know, starts our adventure going to this luxury hotel. And I will say our main character makes a lot of dumb decisions where you know, my husband and I were both, you know, kind of yelling at the audiobook that, you know, why would you make that decision? But, you know, it was a good time. It was an enjoyable ride. So we gave it like 3.75 stars, and, you know, it was definitely worth a listen at least once. Next I have This Is Your Captain Speaking. This is a weird book. I started off, and I, you know, within about 30, 35, 45 pages, I wasn't even sure if I should keep reading or if I should DNF, because some of the situations and the characters were so weird. But I just kept pushing through, and ultimately I had a, you know, somewhat enjoyable time. But it is an out there kind of weird book. It's not in print, and you know, I don't think that it did well on the bookshelves. But essentially it takes the story of Captain Sully landing a plane, emergency landing on the Hudson River, and how heroic and successful that event was. And they're taking that same story but making satire out of it. So what if this wasn't a miracle? What if it was a staged publicity stunt from the airline? So this failing airline that wants a way to boost their numbers, to boost their, you know, popularity. And, you know, you have some really strange characters involved with it, some people that, you know, someone that wasn't supposed to be on the plane, someone that the airline specifically put on the plane, you know, hoping that they would, you know, write news or articles or stories about it. And so it's just, it was an interesting book. It was, like I said, not a book for everyone. You know, it's not an easy book to find either, so it's probably not worth any of that effort, but I had an okay time. I had an enjoyable enough time with it, but it was a weird one. Then the last book that I read was A Girl and Five Brave Horses. This is a memoir, and this was my favorite book for the month. In the book, you have Sonora, and she ends up taking a pretty wild job and has a wild ride at it. But Doc Carver is a man who started training horses to dive off of a platform, a diving board, essentially, a diving platform, and into a pool of water. And so, you know, it was a very successful show, and, you know, he brought it around the country to different museums or carnivals and things like that. And about 10 years after he started diving horses, Sonora's mother actually tells her that, you know, she should talk to Doc Carver, you know, because she likes horses and adventure and travel. You know, maybe she would be good as a diving girl for this show. And at first she's not convinced because it sounds very wild, but then she sees the horse diving in action and decides that she really does want to do it. And so it just follows her life of, you know, training to be a diving girl, you know, all of the horses she's worked with along the way. Because, I mean, she did it for, I don't know, nearly 20 years or around that time frame. She did it for quite a while. And then also, too, she had an accident midway through her career and was blinded, but she, you know, talks about adapting to that disability and, you know, continuing to dive horses, continuing her job there. So it was really just fascinating. And I had this book on my radar because of the Disney movie Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, which is kind of a fictionalized version of her story. And it definitely, I just rewatched the movie. It definitely is not the same story. They definitely took bits and pieces of her story and adapted it for movie, and, you know, took certain characters and made them meaner or sterner or added more drama here or there. But ultimately it was still, you know, I still really enjoyed the movie, even though it's not a direct adaptation of the book. And the book was really good as well. So I gave that one 5 stars. That was my favorite for the month, and that was everything I read this month in March. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye now.